This is the European edition of Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. We bring you the European unicorns, startups, founders, regulators, and leaders innovating the rapidly evolving fintech scene today. A truly localized podcast with both English and local language content, with some of the world's most well-known hosts and influencers in the fintech sector globally. Join us every week as we explore what makes the European Union a phenomenal proving ground for many of the fastest growing fintech plays in the world today. Okay, let's roll.
Hey guys, welcome to Breaking Banks Europe, episode number 34, and is another ecosystem zoom in. Let's start by welcoming my long-term friend, Claire Calmejane. Claire, welcome to the show.
Hello, hi everyone.
So Claire, you and I go back a long time when we practically started fintech in London. That's, let's call a cat, as we say in Italian. And I would love you to start introducing yourself, even if there will be only probably less than 2% of our audience who don't know who you are. But please, tell us a little bit your role in Société Generale and how did you land there?
Sure. Thanks, Matteo. Yes, so I'm currently serving as a Chief Innovation Officer of Société Generale, which is present in 61 countries and have 15 different lines of business that goes from 7 different retail banks in France, Romania, Czech Republic, Africa, Russia, and to basically car leasing. And we have one of the leaders in Europe called ALD. So it's a variety of work, crossing insurance and financial services that is just from few groups. And as such, what I do is I have a global role where I have 2 main missions. The first one is to accelerate the business transformation. And here we will work more on the digitalization of the business towards client centricity and efficiency. And the second mission is really around creating new businesses. And for that, I oversee SG Venture, or 150 million impact fund, as well as some specific ventures such as Trezor, which was one of the startups we acquired, which is a leader of Bank as a Service in Europe, but also some startups we create, such as Forge, which is a digital asset startup, and recently did an emission of covered bond, which was the first worldwide one to be paid in a digital euro by Banque de France. And now we have a specific call to project from Banque de France where several different actors are pitching on that. So it's a wide range. I'm also a mom of 2. So, the days are full on. And I'm also an active contributor to the fintech landscape in Europe, because we'll talk about it in a sec, but it's never a country game. It's always, for Europe, it's about how do we work together, and being able to start in London, where fintech was very strong, and to come in France. It was, really an honor to support some of the fintech funders to strengthen also their network from a European level and to keep working with them, because of course in banks we have a very high need for digitalization, and we need to be able to consume all these startups and the products delivered by this startup, as much as to embrace their mindset, which is agile and nimble, and they need to learn from us about protecting the customer, regulation, serving as a trusted party. So there are a lot of synergies here.
Thank you, Claire. So as you see, dear auditors, is an intense life of fintech innovation and family, which is, is always challenging. So let me explain you a little bit to you guys how this show is going to work. So, Claire, had an imperative. So we decided to give her the floor for a few minutes, and then we're going to have a debate where we will invite venture capitalists, startups, and other players of the ecosystem. But I didn't want to miss the opportunity to have an eye of someone who, coming from a very evolved and historically very intense and rich ecosystem, sort of came into one of the European countries, like most of the countries, that sort of followed up, after UK. Claire, how did you see, evolving this French ecosystem that seems in the last 2-3 years to have developed sort of almost brutally, right? And today is all of a sudden, with Station F, and it almost became a center of the startups overnight.
Yeah, I mean, that's very true. I think about 2-3 years, you could see France starting to rise in terms of leader in Europe about raising seed capital, which indicated that there was a lot of small startups that started to be created. And this was also under the government impulsion to create and facilitate, for example, French tech visas for talent, foreigner talent that will want to come and work in some strategic topic of France, such as deep tech, AI, digital assets we've just talked about. And so now this startup have grown. And there was before that, it was already a long-term effort. So if you look at FinTech, we had FinTech such as Shine, Conto, Lydia. And Conto and Lydia have recently raised with Tencent. And they are now reaching maturity on the landscape. So France clearly, on the last 10 months, have created 7 more unicorns. So even if valuation is not the only criteria, give an indication of the pace and the intensity of the work that is going on in France, as well as obviously it's attracting more and more foreign investors that will support the scaling up. And France is also taking actions to make sure European fund will not only support seed investment, but will be able to support the scaling of this company. And this is very important because as part of COVID, one point that was critical and that point that France is really adamant is a sovereignty agenda and to make sure that we have startups that are best of breed, that support locally our economy and that are the driver of tomorrow's economy.
And I think, you're totally right. I just want you to double dip quickly on one thing that you said, which I thought is just really simply true, is never a country game, right? It's really an ecosystem, in this case, an European game. And I believe that especially in this almost post-COVID, because it's just not over yet, and you and I are living in countries that have been particularly, touched and challenged by it. I believe that it's only together that we're going to pull out of it, right?
Yes.
So, Claire, thank you very much. I know that you have a super important meeting, and I don't want to keep away from it, so I give you a little bit of time to prepare. Thank you for sort of having kicked off this France ecosystem Zoom in, and stay tuned for the following debate. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Matteo. Happy have fun.
As promised, after Claire joined her super important occupations, we're back into the show, slightly changing the format. So, as promised, I'm here with Nina, my co-host today. Nina, welcome to the show. Welcome back.
Hello, thank you.
And let me salute our fellow panelists today, Alain, Philippe, and Caroline. And let's continue our chat about the French ecosystem by let them introduce themselves. Let's start with Alain. Alain, just because the one beside me in the Zoom chat.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome.
So my name is Alain Clot. I've been in the financial sector for a century, to be a bit more serious, for a few decades. Firstly, as a banker, and I've been more on the alternative finance side for the last 10 years. And I'm currently occupying 3 functions or 3 missions, to be more specific. I'm being a senior advisor at EY. I'm being a business angel in 10-ish, 15-ish startups, mainly in the financial sector. And I'm the founding chairman of France FinTech, the association gathering the French startups of the financial sector ecosystem in France.
Merci, Alain. Philippe, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and thank you for hosting us. My name is Philippe. I have basically only 2 occupations. One being the founder and general partner of Partech. Besides managing the firms, I am still take care of the venture, which means the early stage investment, and I am more or less the fintech guy as Partech. I invested in quite a lot of them. Compte Nickel that exited with BNP, Cantox in London. We are also investor in Alain in Paris. We are investors TOS in Korea, a 3 billion neobank out of Korea. We are investor in Cash in Japan. We are investor in the Grounders in New York. That means that we have over 35 fintech investments. Besides my day occupation at Partech, I only have one outside occupation, which is I'm a board member of Unibail Rodamco Westfield, which is the largest mall operator in the world.
Thank you, Philippe. And last but not least, Caroline Lamaud. I've got the pleasure to meet her in this chat, but she seems totally fit this gang of misfits in the French ecosystem. Caroline, welcome to the show.
Thank you. My name is Caroline, and I have only one occupation. I'm a fintech entrepreneur. I'm one of the founders of Anaxago. We are a French investment platform, a unique destination for private investors to pick smart financial investments. We offer a wide range of financial products which are deeply rooted in the real economy. People are able to see where their money goes and how productive it is, performing revenues for them and growth for the economy. More than 230 million euros have already been invested through our digital platform, where we also offer financial advice. It's something we added recently because we kind of realized that people came to us to find products, but also to receive financial counsel. So we are slowly moving into wealth management with the platform, and it's super exciting.
Thank you.
And if I may, Caroline, you've got a second occupation that you've forgotten.
I'm a board member at France FinTech. I'm a proud board member at France FinTech, and I work with alongside Alain on our international occupations.
Quite a privilege to have you on board.
Okay, guys. So the idea of the show today is let's try to tell the auditors of Breaking Banks Europe what they wouldn't know about the French ecosystems, right? And I would start with Alain because you're sort of the builder of this federation that puts all the stakeholders together. What's your analysis?
We did it together on the 12 of us. It's been a collective effort. And to be frank, I was quite surprised that they jumped on me to chair the association, since I've been in the business, as you said, for centuries. So they picked up an old guy to run the show. I still wonder why. Anyway, it's been the case. So maybe a word of history before I describe ecosystem. The French started at a quite early stage in terms of alternative finance. And as usually, when it comes to France, it's always paradoxal. Started in the early 90s with genuinely alternative businesses such as Boursorama, Cortal, etc. And a quite high French consumers of internet finance. And then, for some reasons, we fell behind for three main reasons. First one, lack of venture financing in this country. Second one, our regulator was much more ruling by the book and not that much innovation friendly. And the third one, which is to me the main one, we've been struggling in front of very powerful institutions called the French banks, purely universal one-stop shopping businesses, extremely dominant on the market, so it's been a bit tough. For the last, I would say, 6-7 years, we've started speeding up. And today, the ecosystem is well structured. We've got 600 fintechs in France, covering all the ranges of verticals from robo-advisor, aggregators, payments, financing, neobank, insurtech, etc. We've got 3 unicorns, but to be frank, the 3 of them being these days mainly financed in the US. And it's the implication in the US market that explain the spectacular growth in terms of valuation. And we've got 10-ish startups, some of them mentioned by Philippe a few minutes ago, that are either half the way or in the middle, between 500 and 1 billion in different areas. We've raised last year 700 million euros, which is to say doubling up the amount raised the year before. In the beginning of this year, we were on the same trend, doubling up the amount of last year. But obviously, this crisis has slowed down the whole thing. I guess we'll get back to that. I don't want too long. But the ecosystem is now well structured, operating reasonably well, and cooperating a lot with incumbents. There are around 700 agreements, JVs, cooperations with banks or insurers in France, which we are very happy of.
Caroline, lovely to have you with us today. You are, amongst a lot of things, also a board member, we've just learned, but also a co-founder. So I'd love to hear, after everything we've heard from Alain, about the ecosystem that we have in France for tech and fintech specifically, how your journey has been as an entrepreneur in this space, the challenges, the benefits that you've seen for growing your business.
Well, to be honest, back in 2012, when we launched the company, being a fintech entrepreneur felt like going against everyone and anyone. Market authorities, regulatory representatives, and even government. I remember the time where we received a letter saying that what we were doing was illegal and we might end up in jail. At some point, crypto companies were persona non grata in every bank and they were refused the right to open a bank account. I even know a crypto entrepreneur who kept every rejection letter he received from banks. So that was back then. The things evolved over the years, and with this corona crisis, fintech became a real asset for everyone in the country. I mean, we even started distributing state-backed loan through digital crowdfunding platform. So we kind of got accepted, and regulations came through that made our job easier on a day-to-day basis. So nowadays, it really feels like we are part of a movement that wants to go forward. It's a business ecosystem, but it's also a political ecosystem. And I feel quite lucky to have launched a company at that point in the French history, because I really feel that fintech is the next page for the finance industry in the country.
It's really interesting that you mention that. So I was just thinking back to when I lived in Paris and the pain that I had trying to work with my bank, whose name I won't name. It was LCA. And how painful the journey was trying to bank with them, to now today when I see on Instagram my friends are sharing their Lydia usernames, people can send money to each other. And that's all happened, as you said, from the time of 2012, maybe being told you'll be thrown into jail or a cease and desist, to now much more widespread use. I'm curious, all three of you, if you want to comment on what has changed. If you had to choose one thing, what is the one thing that has changed, that has moved France closer to this more open, more innovative time that we're living in now?
Something that, before I ask a question to Philippe, something that Alain didn't say super clearly, Caroline just mentioned sort of, in between the lines, but I would say it loud and clear, because I'm half French. I married one, lived 10 years in Paris, 7 in Brussels. My French is possibly, as bad as my Italian, so I know a little bit, right, the place.
Does marrying a French person make you French?
No, but my two sons were born there.
Matteo is clearly part of us.
Yeah,
in any aspect, including in language terms.
So all this to say that French were nowhere near the center of the fintech map when it all started in 2008, 2009. The level 39 in London. It took a little while before creating, a center of gravity in terms of startups and investment. Philippe, you will have a direct question on it later on. So was there a turning point, or was simply the fact that, you guys first figured this out, look around and say, okay, now let's put the billions where our, mouth is, and let's kickstart it?
Okay, so let me say a few things on both the offer side and the demand side, because the two legs are working together. On the offer side, the three weaknesses I've mentioned earlier have been corrected. Firstly, we jumped from the last position in terms of venture financing in Europe to the second position ahead of the Germans. But Philippe, who is an expert, will elaborate on that with some things missing within the scope, especially seed financing, which is poor in this country because there are not that many funds fully dedicated to that. And acceleration, I would say, between 15 and 35. Once again, despite things are moving, on Partech, for example, is helping by a great deal. So this is the first weakness that has been corrected. The second one, I mentioned our regulator, which was, and obviously you understand what I mean, Matteo, very much Latin in its culture, ruling by the book, which is to say purely on the level playing field, and protecting the customer by, avoiding some dangerous situation to occur. I'm not telling you he jumped into an Anglo-Saxon culture, but he's gone through some kind of cultural revolution. And clearly now the quantity and the quality of dialogue we're having with our two regulators is extremely satisfactory. We are able to communicate with him when we are launching something to ensure that we are going the right direction and avoiding what I call the tunnel effect, working for 2 years and then ending up with a no in terms of agreement. So clearly, they have massively progressed, dedicating teams specifically to fintechs and working together, which is in the country is something. The market regulator and the banking regulator JVing together, to us, was quite of a premiere. And the last thing that has changed is on the demand side, and to me is the main one. Consumers 10 years ago were extremely loyal to their bank supplier, having only one supplier, not diversifying, not shopping around, etc. Obviously, all this has changed, just like it's changing in the whole world. And now most people are having, several suppliers, apps, taking opportunities here or there, going discount one time and premium the other time. So we are progressively joining the pack. So it has accelerated the whole thing. And also, last thing, not to be too long, I would like to mention is the level of cooperation between banks and fintechs. I would say 10 years ago, everybody was working on its own side. Now, since over 15% of our fintechs are working on a B2B basis, the level of cooperation is extremely good. And on both cooperation and competition side, and it's taken as a sound situation now by incumbents, which has changed a lot.
And actually, that is a good transition to get finally Philippe into the mix. And you're not at the first round of being a venture capitalist, right? Clearly, and yet, Partech is by far one of the most known players, in the VC space, not only in France actually. And you mentioned, several of your investments around the world. Could you please give us your own lens, in how the ecosystem evolved? If you keep your investor hat and see how mentality has changed and how France has become now, a place where investors are actually looking all over the world when they think of the deals to make.
Yeah, I think what Alain said about the history of the ecosystem is very, very true. We were lacking 3 ingredients. First, the entrepreneurs, because something that has not been mentioned yet, but it's super important. 20 years ago, when you were a top graduate from engineering school or business school, you were going into traditional companies.
Absolutely.
That has changed totally, and that's probably the single most important factor. The second one was the lack of capital. I'm going to come back to that. And the third one, which is not to be neglected in the fintech space, is the fact that, as Alain said, the banks were pretty powerful in France. And unlikely the UK post-2008, the regulator didn't want specifically to have some startups to emerge in the ecosystem. In London, there was clearly a sense of revenge. People wanted to facilitate the emergence of a new generation of financial institution. That was not the case at that time in France, partly because the magnitude of the 2000 crisis has been less severe in France than in other countries in Europe. To come back to your direct question about the change of the financing, after 2008, there has been a big push towards seed that was terribly lacking at that time. The President Sarkozy realized that entrepreneurship was key to get out of the crisis, and that has been a huge effort from the states to launch several seed funds. This has been quite successful. At European level, and France is number 2 in this in Europe. There are more seed startup than in the US for the first time in 2019. That means that Europe has overtaken the US in this market segment for the first time. Pretty impressive. That's the most dynamic continent. It's still not perfect, but most of the entrepreneurs that we see testify that if you have a good idea, it's relatively easy to get the 2-3 first million. That was not the case 5 years ago. And by the way, at Partech, we are now covering all segments. We have one of the largest seed funds in Europe, over 100 million, and we do as well venture and growth. Other extreme of the spectrum, there has been also dramatic change. We are not totally on par with the US yet. That's probably still the lacking part of the ecosystem. A lot of people in France are working hard to close the gap, Euraseo and Partech and some others, to be able to do rounds, let's say, above 100 million. Most of the time, still in Europe, if you want to raise more than 115 million, there is always some US fund involved. And it's probably not to change anytime soon. It takes a long time to build a growth ecosystem. On the venture side, the early stage side is the middle. I think we are quite competitive. And what we see is slowly but surely emerging in venture capital, a European ecosystem. There are, let's say, between 10 and 15 funds competing all over Europe for the best deal. It makes it a tougher business for us. It's very, very good and sound for the entrepreneurs. If I am to summarize, seed and venture, very competitive, at par with what you can find anywhere else in London or in the States. Growth still a bit lacking behind, but trying to close the gap as soon as possible. There is still some drawbacks for the French ecosystem. You know, and we all know, and it's highly debated, there is no pension fund. And the fact of having no pension fund is, of course, as a consequence on having long-term money for huge private equity investments. The pay-as-you-go system is probably nice, but it's not the best for financing emerging projects.
Thank you, Philippe. Guys, let's have a super short break. We are sort of live, but the show is in 2 parts. And stay tuned, we'll come back soon. And it's a wrap.
Do you want to be part of Breaking Banks Europe? Reach out and learn more about the opportunity to be featured in one of our shows. With over 1.6 million listeners and counting, Breaking Banks Europe is bound to become the place to advance critical dialogue in Europe and the UK fintech scene. Reach out on Instagram or Twitter at Breaking Banks EU, or go to www.provoke.fm.
Hey guys, welcome back. So Philippe just gave us a great sort of status of, what are the gaps, how fast the ecosystem adapted in terms of, being able to raise capital and being able to fund startups. But let's check with Caroline, as an entrepreneur, how easy or complicated or challenging was to raise money, as an entrepreneur. And when you certainly, speaking with other entrepreneurs in France, what's the general feeling about raising money in France is? Because I'm sure as hell, until 5 or 6 years ago, it wasn't that easy.
Well, I'm a very bad example when it comes to raising funds, because I think we're the least funded fintech in France, because we crowdfunded our business or on our own platform, and we raised, I think, was 2 million 6 years ago. The company.
Well, if you're still talking right now, is a pretty excellent example, actually, of an entrepreneur. Congratulations.
We got lucky because the company got break-even quite soon, so we didn't need to raise funds. Some people might say that what we did in 7 years, we might have done in 4 if we had more money, but that's not the path we decided to choose. However, what we saw was, as Philippe said, a real evolution in the funding mindset. And that's what made I think that's what makes the fintech scene so successful in France. Fintech business are kind of, it's reliable. It's something that you want to believe in. It's useful. It's serious. And when fintech started to raise funds, it became like a real engagement for investors to pledge in for a brighter future, to build a new industry. So it really helped build up the fintech ecosystem in France. And we saw that exploding over the past few years, but we weren't a part of it, honestly. So
Caroline, and sorry, before actually we go to the next questions, I actually want to leave you because it's a sort of a tradition, in the Breaking Bad. So whenever there is an entrepreneur or a startup, we'll always give the opportunity to talk a little bit more about what they do. And you sort of quickly mentioned it in your own personal intro, but give our audience the 3-minute pitch of what Anaxago goes. Please knock yourself out.
Okay, that's really kind. Well, we started as an equity crowdfunding platform, funding startups, and then we moved on into a wider range of investment products, offering real estate and other life insurance or other financial products that people like to invest in. And the success came quite quickly. We only address private investors who want to do something smart with their money and are not happy with their banking services. So people are coming to the platform to choose their investments, follow them, and find performance where sometimes they might be complicated, especially nowadays, to make great investments. So yeah, that's what we do.
Well, that leads us actually quite nicely into the next question, and that would be around artificial intelligence. So at Breaking Banks, we cover so many topics, some that fit nicely into each other, and I think this one is one of them. In 2019, actually, France was the country that received the most VC funding in all of Europe, specifically for AI-based companies. There was also the creation of the Hub France AI, which counts SNCF, La Banque Postale, L'Oréal as part of its contributors or members, and also lots of fun things going around with the supercomputer Generale. I highly recommend you look it up if you have the time. But that being said, comes with, I look back fondly at the bureaucracy sometimes of France and this recent regulation when it comes to the acquisition of AI-based businesses and approval needed from the government. So I'm curious from your end, Alain, Philippe, what your thoughts on this are. Does this make France more competitive? What is the thinking behind it? And do you see it as a plus or maybe a bit of a detriment for entrepreneurs working in that space in France?
It's a legitimate question because France has had some bad stories in the past. I think this question probably stems from the old story about Dailymotion. I was one of the earlier investors in Dailymotion, the video platform. Yahoo wanted to acquire it, and one of the French Secretary of State of Industry said that Yahoo was not welcome at that time. And I think it has been extremely detrimental to the French ecosystem for years. I must say it was a huge mistake. That being said, I think this time is over. This is very true that there has been a regulation introduced to be sure that strategic technology will not be sold to some unwanted acquirers. This is pretty simple. Every time that any of these company is bought with AVAI, for example, embedded, you must notify the government. This is not an exception. When you look at the US, they have introduced exactly the same regulation.
And do you feel, though, especially from, as this is BBEU, speaking about the European Union in general, do we feel that there is maybe room for us to say perhaps it's a data privacy or keeping that information to ourselves kind of play? Is that me being too cynical?
No. I think it's a very difficult debate. For example, there is a European regulation that says that the sensitive data of a consumer must be stored in Europe. Mm-hmm. That's something that, for example, very few of my colleague VCs no, but for example, our data must be stored, our data from Partech must be stored in the European Union. And that's something that, for example, companies of Microsoft and others are very well used to. They just store our data on European platforms. That's the first element. That's something that I think is, in fact, is not illegitimate in my view, that data of the European consumer or sensitive businesses remain in Europe. I don't see any issue. The other issue is about protectionism, and I think there is a fine balance. The fine balance being we need, and that's something pretty terrible to admit, but we need to have outside acquirers, especially from the US. At Partech, we sell over 80% of our companies to US investors, to US acquirers. We are in the middle of a Cold War between the US and China, and I think we need to be smart enough to welcome this investor, and at the same time to be able to have European-wide ecosystem to emerge. Because the most important lacking element in the French ecosystem is wealthy buyers. We don't have them. This is probably one of the attempts to have this buyer emerge in Europe. In my view, it will take another 10 years. In summary, there are some regulation. I think that the time of over-regulation is over. When you see, and you mentioned it briefly in your question, we are not only the countries that got the most AI investment in Europe last year, we are the countries that got most foreign investor in the economy last year overall. That's the reason why will I be a foreign entrepreneur or a foreign investor, I will not be too worried. I think the best example, Temasek from Singapore did 2 investments recently in French startup. By the way, Partech companies. GA loves to do now investment in Europe and especially in France. I think the time for unsmart protectionism is over.
Excellent. Alain, anything else to add?
Yeah, I don't think it's any specific to this market. Most of the markets are trying to reasonably protect themselves, and it's about strategic areas. And both artificial intelligence and finance are being considered, rightly to me, strategic in this country. Look at the position of France in terms of foreign investment. We are ranking either number 1, number 2, depending on the quarters. Let's keep in mind that, firstly, France is investing heavily on artificial intelligence. We're enjoying the position of number 1 in Europe in terms of labs dedicated to artificial intelligence. Number 2 in Europe in terms of startups dedicated to AI. And at the same time, valuation are quite average, not to say low, in this country. You know, to be very clear, we are missing our position globally in terms of fintech is okay, but we are missing the N26s, the TransferWises or the Revoluts, because multiples are still where they are. So clearly, our future is to be European, pan-European. We're dreaming of some kind of Airbus dedicated to fintech, but before that step, we need to build up strong domestic presences. Keep in mind that recently some very exotic investors decided to put significant money into the French ecosystem, namely Tencent investing in Conto and Lydia, and it didn't create any problem, any issue. And now Tencent is a shareholder of both. So clearly, is to be as less naive as possible at a moment where valuations are building up, but still modest, and not being in any way rejecting for investors, partners, etc. Keep in mind that there are very big discussions going on this time in shipping, car industry, etc. And the French will end up either at 50-50 or even minority stake. While those positions, those areas are considered extremely strategic.
So a quick one on now that Claire is not around, so we can talk freely about banks, right? So not that we couldn't, of course, because Claire is usually very impartial and she has a long experience as well. But my take on this is that French incumbents sort of follow the same, path of, the whole ecosystem, right? So it took a little while, then all of a sudden realized that, they played small for a while, and then, they joined the crowd, typically Société Generale with their fund, but it wasn't, an immediate catch. Quick analysis, maybe like, Philippe, would you agree on this? Because then there is the traditional post-COVID positive vibe question that all of us need to answer to.
Okay. Alain knows the ecosystem, the banking system, as well as I do, and I'm sure he will complement. There was a kind of particular situation in France after 2008, and it explains a lot. The French banks did suffer less. They were, as Alain explained, universal banks, and they were quite powerful. That's the reason why they probably underestimate the strength of the fintech revolution. But you need to realize that a bank as Crédit Agricole that almost nobody knows outside of France has almost 18 million consumers. That's something very, very, very unknown. People always think about BNP and SocGen. SocGen has only 6 million. That means you see that some institutions that are not well known, pretty quiet, outside of Paris, have massive strengths in terms of consumer. First element. The second element, the regulation was protecting them. And the regulation, in a way, is still protecting them. Let's take a very, very example on COVID. One of my company, October, French company operating in all countries, were allowed to distribute the loans guaranteed by the states in Holland, in Italy, before they were allowed in France because the bank tried to ban them from this regulation. That means that the banking world is still extremely powerful. Second element you need to realize is that these banks were more powerful than in other countries in Europe. When you look at 2019, you need to realize that globally, the German banks have been collectively losing money in 2019. That means that in some part of Europe, especially Italy and Germany, the banks were pretty weak. Third element that is common to all the European banks is the lack of market cap. Before 2008, the market cap for BNP and JP Morgan was almost at par. When you took 2020, before the crisis, that was almost 250 billion for JP Morgan Chase, against something like 60 million for BNP. That means that they are, in a way, protected, in another way, probably a bit weak to do massive acquisition.
Well, you did touch on something that we'd like to turn our attention to, which is the state-backed loans. Given the current coronavirus crisis, and I know France is slowly opening up, or maybe not so slowly opening up. People are out and about now, back at cafes. Maybe to end on more of a positive note, what are we seeing in specifically fintech, but maybe broadly in tech, in the ways that coronavirus is giving us hope or giving us reason to believe that this innovation will continue to persist in France? Caroline, shall we start with you?
Well, I think that this crisis made us realize that digital working and working from home and, well, things can be easier than they seem. That's the overall lesson. On the other hand, I'm an entrepreneur. I have a company I have people to pay at the end of the month. So I'm actually, I'm living on a day-to-day basis, trying to envision different scenario for the company and for the state of the country. So I'm trying to stay positive because I feel like there's optimism everywhere. People are so happy to be out and about again. Well, I want to be optimistic that things are gonna not go back to normal, but go back to a new normal with more, I'm sorry, I said it, new normal. With more responsibility, more, our investors, for instance, we asked them what did the corona crisis changed in for their investment choices. And more than 70% of the investment bases said that they wanted to add more impact in their investments. So that's an answer to a survey. We'll need to see if that goes down, but I thought that was really interesting.
Alain, what's your take on this?
Crisis is having an impact in this country just like everywhere else. We estimated that the activity has been reduced by slightly over 50% at the beginning of the process. It has reduced the funding by 20%. And obviously, it has put huge pressure on some segments. For example, payment apps linked to eventful payment or brick and mortar, obviously, the impact was very significant. On some other aspects, it's been positive. And globally, I think at the end of it, we'll consider that it will have been probably positive in terms of impact. Why? Because consumers in this country access to financial services throughout the net with a much bigger proportion that we estimate at 65%. Our own guesstimate about the portion of that increase that will be crystallized is probably 20-25%. So it means a net, very significant increase. I think it will clean up the market as well. Those business models being not that much fine-tuned, settled, etc., will probably be under pressure, and it will push towards some kind of consolidation, either throughout some M&A schemes, and there are some discussions going on, or some market share increase, which is also the case. And all this isn't bad in itself. So I tend to think, to be a bit provocative, if we don't die, we will be stronger. And it so happened that for the time being, we're not dying. So I'm rather optimistic, a bit longer term. I think the 3-4 quarters ahead of us will be tough in terms of both activity and financing.
So I do love co-host shows with Nina because she prepares, so thorough for your questions and the data, and she does everything that I don't do. But there is one thing that I did this time, which is, but not for the show. It's sort of stuck in my mind. The fact that Partech actually has raised a fund on the back, right? On the, I don't want to say post-COVID, but on the sort of a related crisis, $100 million fund, Philippe?
Recovery fund.
Exactly. Now, Philippe, tell me that the only thing that I prepared, it wasn't the right one, or please tell me I'm close enough.
No. It's a 100 million seed fund.
You see? Okay, I got it. So why don't we end up on a positive note to talk a little bit about this fund, because it might give some hope to entrepreneurs that are working on ideas to overcome the crisis.
Yeah, Matteo, if I may, for once I will slightly be more optimistic than Caroline and Alain. I think the digital and the fintech space is probably one of the winners of the crisis. It's very difficult to articulate at a time where a lot of large corps are suffering, but what we see is that outside of the event and of the travel industry, the level of activity of startups has been quite astonishing. You need to keep in mind that some very large bank, and as an act of courtesy, I won't quote the name, the top management of the bank, let's say the 2,000 or 4,000 top people, could not access their email at the same time. There was time slot during the day because the server couldn't handle the traffic. Give me one example of a startup that has been facing this situation. It's amazing. It's almost difficult to believe, but it's not marginal player. It's top French banks that I'm speaking about. The consumer has been used to working remotely. The large banks had to get to work remotely, and I think it will generate a large wave of new investments that will be extremely profitable for the fintech industry. Cooperation, I think, is more than the word of the day. The large banks will cooperate more and more, and I think the fintech sector will be one of the winners of the crisis. On the investment side, to finish on another positive note, there has been two periods during the COVID. There has been the first 3 weeks. People feared within the large funds that the company, the valuation will not stand, that the startup will suffer alone, and they were very, very, very prudent, both on their own investment and doing new investment. What we see from now is, instead of fear, in intense competition for accessing the best startups. It's very, very true in the late stage and growth businesses. I'm sure it will come back soon in the seed stage. We have raised a fund during the COVID period. Some of our other competitors did. There is money on the table, and that's pretty good for the entrepreneurs. Money is there to be invested. It's okay to tell your investors that you don't invest for 3 months. It's okay to say that you don't invest for 6 months, but after 6 months, you need to invest. And I think it's a very, very good message to the entrepreneurs. If you had a great projects, come to see the VCs, come to see the seed investors. There is more than ever a sense that the world is going digital and that post-COVID will be, it's difficult to say, but probably the digital sector as a whole has probably gained 3 or 4 or 5 years. To take one last example out of the fintech sector, something that is worth noticing, Inditex, Zara, the largest textile corporation in the world, they say that digital represented 14% of their sales in 2019. The objective for 2022 is 25%. I think it's a good sign of the magnitude of the change.
Pas mal. You better be careful what you wish for, Philippe. I'm going to come knocking on your door. If you say you're writing checks, I'm coming to knock on your door.
But that's our job, to write checks.
Amazing.
We say no often, but if we don't write checks, we don't have any raison d'être. Huh?
Very, very true. Well, just before we close out, we'll start with Philippe, since you were just speaking. For our listeners, if they want to learn more about you, more about Partech, where can they find you?
www.partech.com.
Parfait. Caroline?
At the Edgar Café in Paris. No, on my LinkedIn, I'm quite responsive.
Amazing. And Alain, where can our listeners find you?
On the France FinTech site. And we'll welcome any entrepreneur, association, any contributor, anyone who wants to speak to us.
Amazing. And as always, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. Matteo, I'll let you wrap it up.
Thank you, Nina. And thank you, Caroline, Alain, and Philippe. That was a great show. We had fun. I wish we could have done it in French, but maybe let's think of a vertical version of Breaking Banks, Europe, that we can do
more than... That would be a stretch from our French, I think.
Exactly. But
if you know how to say champagne, it's all you need to know in France,
I tapped out after being a barmaid in Paris. That's the extent of my French these days.
Okay, guys, since we are not yet doing any sort of swearing or bad thing to laugh about, I'll wrap it up like this. Thank you very much for being with us, and stay tuned on Breaking Banks EU. And it's a wrap.
Thanks for listening to Breaking Banks Europe, a Provoke Media podcast in cooperation with FinTech Stage. Don't forget to tweet us out, shout out, or post to the team at Breaking Banks EU on Twitter. If there's something or someone you'd like to hear on our cast, let us know. See you next week on Breaking Banks Europe.